All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. We are going to be talking the stimulus. We are going to be talking the coming recession, and we are going to talk about what it all means for education philanthropy. So I have a fantastic group of panelists with me today, all of whom I've known since the last recession, I think. And so I'm very excited to get to kind of dig in with them. So we've got Andy Rotherham of Bellwether Education Partners, Julie Makuta of the Schusterman Family Foundation. We've got Mike Petrilli of the Fordham Institute and Paul Herdman of the Rodell Foundation. So why don't we just turn things right over to Andy to get us underway. Format for today is we're going to have each of our panelists give a few opening remarks. I've got a whole bunch of questions for all of them that I'm dying to dig into. And we encourage everyone who's participating, has joined us as a participant, to throw questions in the chat whenever you have them. You can target them to one of our panelists. You can target them to all. But we hope this is highly interactive and gets you what you need. All right, with that, I'm going to turn things over to Andy.
Thanks, Celine. Thank you for having me. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Even though everyone's working at home and everything, I think everyone is surprisingly busy. At least that's what we're hearing. So appreciate the time. I am sharing my screen. I hope you guys should be seeing slides. I've got a bunch of slides. I am not going to go through all of them. After the webinar, I'm pretty easy to find, Andy at bellwethereducation.org, and Celine can certainly connect you with me. So if there's stuff you want to see more of and so forth, feel free, but I'm not going to pause on every slide in this loop. You can also go to our website to learn about Bellwether. The part of this that I think is salient that I do want to tee up for this discussion is immediately, like I'm sure everybody on the phone, in early March, we started to restrict team travel and schools closed. And so all of our work that we do in schools, that's evaluation work, strategic advising work, academic advising work, was all full stop because you couldn't get into schools. And so we ended up with a little bit of extra capacity unexpectedly. And so we made that available pro bono to the field, because we felt that was better than keeping people idled. And the result was we've learned a lot about the needs. We made that available specifically for school districts and for charter networks. And so we've learned a lot about the needs that folks are having, particularly school districts are having. And we've got a long list of folks who still need help. And I think the key thing that I want to share out of that we're learning is the national conversation, and I think there's a real risk, and I talk about some device data, this will come up again. The national conversation, I think, is being driven for better or for worse by people who tend to live in places where device access is taken as a given, broadband access is taken as a given. That's the kind of places a lot of leaders in our sector inhabit. And you're getting like the fun stories in the newspaper about what it's the novel adventure of being a homeschool parent and all of this. A lot of kids were sent home with nothing, and a lot of places there's not good broadband access, and a lot of places kids don't have access to devices or like a combination of those three things. And the kind of things that a lot of school districts are asking us about is basic stuff on how do you assess device access? How do you make like really rudimentary questions around these pivots? And I don't mean to say that in any pejorative way towards these districts. I think everybody was caught by surprise by this, but just the conversation and setting up elaborate online platforms and all that. There's some great stuff. As a family, we're availing ourselves of it, but this is not the experience of kids across the country. It's not the kinds of things that school districts are coming to us for the most part asking about. A lot of it is much more 101 stuff. I think everybody's aware of the school closures and what's going on in a lot of the schools that are closed for the rest of the year. And in a lot of these states, the closure for the rest of the year was unexpected. And so kids, again, were sent home, sometimes with packets, often with nothing. And so there's some huge issues there. Big gaps in access to devices. And then often, even if kids have access to devices, parents now need it for some element of their work or maintaining other elements of their life, or there's multiple kids in a household who need access to that device. So even kids who have access to it, that doesn't mean that's a one-to-one situation for them. So huge equity issues there. School districts are doing a bunch of different things. And I think the one thing I would take away, this is from an AASA, the School Superintendents Association survey, is they're doing so many things that you can suspect that not all these things are being done effectively with fidelity. And in some places, when we see the engagement data on kids, lots of kids aren't actually engaged. Book and paper is becoming a last resort, but there's still not a lot of support for that. There's some vendors that have done a great job making print materials available, but there's still not a lot of work. A lot of folks are their long-term strategy, and by long-term, I mean over the next few weeks in this case, is some sort of connectivity play. But we're not going to, despite the money in the CARES Act and so forth, we're not going to like dramatically change connectivity in just a few weeks. And you're seeing a lot of stories that are great, places that are distributing MiFi districts. The public school district my kids are in did that. We distributed MiFis. That's terrific, but that's not what's happening everywhere. School buses that are being outfitted with Wi-Fi and placed around communities. Again, that's terrific. It's a compelling story, but that is not the norm. And I do worry we're sort of, as we often do in this sector, we're getting caught up in these interesting conversation pieces rather than the larger aggregate trends that the data point us to. So huge challenges reaching students, particularly disconnected students, homeless students, students in the foster system, a lot of rural kids. We do a lot of work on this, and one thing we've seen is there actually are some lessons from folks who are already serving disconnected kids who are operating in fragmented systems that can now be applied here, because pretty much every kid in the country is now a disconnected kid in a fragmented system. So there's some lessons there, but there's also some acute challenges serving special needs kids and so forth that we need to be attentive to. The federal government's been pretty responsive with guidance. They're putting out some waiver stuff to allow states some flexibility and so forth. They've taken some steps on higher ed. The CARES Act codifies some of that and puts in place some forward-looking stuff we can talk about. But the big thing I want to pause on the CARES Act is this is just a visual description. And as we all get older, it's harder and harder to see these visual descriptions, the fine print. But here's the big takeaway. That gray arrow, that's the K-12 and the education money that's in there. It was a small piece of a very big bill. And I think that's something that we should potentially pause on. I'd love to hear the opinions of my colleagues on this. There's going to have to be future stimulus bills, but as this one was getting put together, there was just a huge absence of leadership in terms of like big, bold ideas, big things that money could go to help schools address this, and not even, again, online stuff, print, getting material to kids, real basic practice kinds of pieces. And I think there was a price to be paid for that. In fact, like a lot of the energy in the sector was put into fights over old fights about accountability and special education and sort of relitigating those things rather than big forward-looking ideas. And we paid a price for that. And we don't want to make that mistake again. The sector is going to need bold ideas when the next round, so that there's champions on Capitol Hill who can actually carry that money and get school districts what they need. What's in there? There's subgrants to LEAs. There's $14 billion for higher ed, and there's $3 billion for a governor's education relief fund. And this includes the governor of Puerto Rico and includes Mayor Bowser in Washington, D.C. That's very flexible money, and that's money that I would be paying attention to if I was a philanthropic, if I was thinking about partners, if I were a grantee in a state and I had a particularly good relationship with my governor and there was something I could do for that was broader and would have broader systemic impact. That is flexible money, and people are going to need ideas on how to spend it. I'm sure you'll hear some ideas on this call. Early ed has been hit hard by this, and there's a lot of lessons for what happened in early ed in the last downturn and how rough that was. We're going to see the same things here. There's all the same stuff, economic, public health, and then some really acute developmental and learning needs there. And that's a part of the sector that's been largely overlooked in most of the conversations that you're hearing, and they're being impacted. There's some stuff in the CARES Act for them. And then, as I said, there's some other streams. Last just thing to pay attention to, we don't know. I mean, look, the stock market, the last time I looked at it when I was coming over to get Wi-Fi to do this, like investors seem to think that maybe we're going to get through this pretty quick. The market's up today. It's been rallying this past week. Who knows? The unemployment figures we're getting right now are like looking at a mountain through a keyhole. We can barely really get a sense of what's happening with a almost full stop of the economy in a lot of places. Maybe we're going to bounce back. We'll be able to restart it pretty quickly. Maybe we won't, but this is unprecedented. That has consequences for us. Schools are primarily state and local funded. They're funded on things like sales tax revenue, transfer taxes, things like that tend to take a dip during the recession. I mean, the good news is sin taxes don't, and everyone seems to be drinking more. but that's not going to be enough to finance schools. And so all these volatile taxes we're going to be impacted by. So things that we're looking at going forward, we're doing some work on, there's immediate stuff like high school graduation, grade promotion. There's a lot of complicated stuff when you suddenly end school years, things that are going to affect students' NCAA eligibility, things like that. And so there's a lot of stuff to unwind there. Midterm, things like summer school, intensive tutoring, Mike's idea on do we end up redshirting kids, all this kind of stuff. Charter authorizers are going to have a real hard time with some authorizing decisions in the absence of data, and some of the old patterns there that are not necessarily good patterns may reemerge. We should pay attention to that. Also accountability determinations and so forth. Longer term, economic downturn is going to have real serious downstream effects. The sudden spike in online education, I think everyone assumes it's going to be a boon. Maybe it won't. Parents might not actually like what they're experiencing here. It could, there's going to be some effects there, and they could go either way. And then finally, like I was thinking, an interesting thought question. If even 1% of public school parents right now change their behavior in a marked way because of what they've experienced here, so they decide to become homeschoolers, or they decide to enroll in an online, full-time online school, they decide they want a private school with very little technology because they missed that one-on-one. 1% of people changing their behavior after something like this would not be unexpected, would have huge effects for us as we think about the system. So I'll leave you with that. Look forward to hearing my other panelists and also to all of your questions. And again, thank you for having me, Celine.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That was a great overview. Julie, what are we hearing? What are you hearing as a large national funder with touch points in a number of different parts of the country? And where do we go from here?
Hi, everybody. My name's Julie Makuta, and I lead the education portfolio for Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation, National Foundation with hometown of Tulsa. And we do most of our work looking right at the instructional core, teachers, professional development, assessments, and curriculum materials. Thank you, Celine, for putting this together. Thank you all for taking time. I'm sure that there are kids running around in your homes and all that, and appreciate your focus for a few minutes here. I'll just start off. I've been thinking about this at the beginning when this started. I thought this is a marathon. We're in for a marathon. And then more recently, I've realized it's not a marathon, actually. It's a marathon of sprints. And we've just got to be gearing up to do a marathon of sprints. And then I realized, actually, it's a marathon of sprints that we need to run like a relay race. I don't know about you all, but the people on my team, some of them are able to go 150% sometime, and some are only able to go 30%. We have to keep going. So internally, we got to pass the baton from one to each other. And I think as foundations, we have to think about this in the same way. As funders, we have to think about this in the same way, because there will be some things that some of us will be able to fund that others can't. But the first foundation, if Foundation A can fund curriculum and technology, and Foundation B can only fund technology, maybe Foundation B doubles down on technology and Foundation A then does more in curriculum. We have to think about this as the whole coming together is to be greater than the sum of the parts. And that means we got to be in communication and collaboration. So Celine, I really appreciate what you're doing here today. I'm going to look at the stimulus conversation through the lens of how we've been thinking about this whole thing in the foundation, and love to get feedback because I just learn from people and get better ideas and how to think better. So we divide this in kind of the basic needs of kids, right? The food, the housing, just the money that their family needs just to stay alive. Looking at it then through the lens of, okay, what's the education sector? How can we be helpful to the education sector specifically? And then how do we help our grantees, especially the ones that are key that we know we want to make sure that are around and thriving. Some expand now, some just need to make sure they make it through. And each of these, I think about, like, there's a lens as we think about the stimulus dollars for each of these. So for example, on the first, like the basic needs of kids, I think it's critical that foundations try to use private dollars to leverage those public dollars. We know those public dollars are now out there, but it doesn't mean they're going to get to all their intended recipients. So what does this look like? In stimulus 2, I think, the states had the option to put free and reduced lunch money onto basically SNAP EBT cards. But in order for them to do that, they had to A, choose to do that, and B, set up some systems in order to be able, like, augment some of their systems that they already have for food to get SNAP payments out. Where can philanthropy play a role, I think, is to come in, and it's something that we're involved with some foundations and help. By the way, we did not do food at the beginning. Remember I said we're instruction, but now we're doing food access too, is kind of the basic needs. Of course, we're all facing that. but can we help states can we build capacity, game plans, resources to present to states so they have in a box a way to do this easily, and so that more kids are getting more of their food money. And same with folks who are kind of who are qualified for those stimulus checks but won't get them, because in order, if all the families that we care so deeply about are able to access these benefits, then our dollars go from the public government, our dollars go faster, and the kids and adults are healthier. So that's kind of the one way to look at the stimulus through basic needs. In the education sector, as Andy said, there's short-term, there's longer-term. Stimulus dollars can, influence both. The way we're looking at this is, what does it really mean to simultaneously, how are we thinking about, especially in our hometown, supporting education? But as funders, we also have the luxury of being able to think ahead. Systems are facing, as Andy said, those basic needs. How do you find kids? Make sure they're safe, make sure they're fed, try to get some kind of education stood up. We can look ahead as funders and say, let's think about how to help schools reopen, right? And part of that is influencing how states and districts spend their dollars. So we're trying to pull together organizations with other funders, pull together with organizations who could help to define those solutions and then get them out to as many school systems as possible over the summer, early in the summer. And then third, in terms of supporting grantees, like you all, we're worried about some of our key grantees. And again, we can't afford to support them and keep them alive. Those stimulus dollars, when they came through with those nonprofit or those small business loans that could convert to grants, were a great opportunity for us to just be able to fill that gap of pushing out information and supports, so then more grantees, especially grantees that are marginalized, that are community-based, that would otherwise not have heard and not be able to apply for them, we're ready at the go. And frankly, leveraging some of our banking relationships where we had them and where nonprofits were pre-existing grantees to help them to accelerate through those processes. So again, looking through this as a lens of, there are public dollars, how can we help to get more access to around these pieces of the education sector, basic needs, and grantee supports. Across all of this, I think it's super important that we keep this focus on collaborations, and we're setting up some work groups with national funders. If folks are willing to join, happy to have you join. I think we'll go into more of that later. I also want to pause and say, as funders, sometimes we are all super well-intentioned, and sometimes we then think that we can get all the great information, and Andy, it's super helpful to start with the grounding and what's happening on the ground, because as we know, probably the closest thing that has happened in the past was Katrina. And as much as there was education benefits in Katrina, the foundation was cracked from the beginning because it was done to, not done with, right? And so we didn't get the deep and the long-lasting results and ability to really accelerate learning and student success. So I want to make sure as funders that we're doing all we can, that when we look back on this, we're not saying that was, again, a kind of done to, not done with situation. And through this all, we're definitely forwarding a racial equity lens, because we know that communities of colors have the least assets and are going to be the hardest hit. And then honestly, like the last thing I'll leave is, sometimes foundations, we can be slow because we don't feel the urgency of the kids. And so the other thread that runs through all we're doing, if it's on like how we're doing stimulus, how we're doing all this first, is just have a much more of an action orientation. And I think being closer and bringing voices of people who are on the ground really helps to keep that moving forward.
That's super helpful, Julie. That was a really great start. And that's a great tee up for Mike. You talked about funders being able to have the ability to look ahead and think down the line and help to get prepared for when schools reopen. And I know Mike is floating some really popular ideas about how to do that. So Mike, help us think down the line.
Sure, happy to. Well, thank you, Celine, and thanks so much for having me on. Folks, those are not antenna coming out of my head. That's our little education gadfly behind me. A couple of things. First of all, Andy laid that out really well. I couldn't have said it better. And I love the way Julie said that this is, really a marathon of sprints, and we got to keep passing the baton. This is going to go in so many different phases, and we don't know what things are going to look like even a couple months from now, 4 months from now, 6 months from now. Maybe it's like the Amazing Race. We know we're racing. We don't know where it's heading to. And so, as Julie said, just having a sense of urgency, but also flexibility and willing to adjust is super important. So in the short term, that means blocking and tackling. I think talking about the devices and the connectivity, funders can help on that, or the printed materials. As you look ahead to next fall, look, we really cannot bank on schools being back to normal and staying back to normal for next school year. Until there's a vaccine, I think we have to accept that there's going to continue to be closures, at least in some areas, if there's another outbreak. I also worry that the public health people are going to say, well, we can kind of get back to normal, but we don't want crowds, so a lot of people are thinking about, okay, that means no sports in front of large crowds or no concerts. Well, what does that mean for a school? How does an elementary school or a high school operate without crowds? Have you been in these schools? And if that's serious, Rick Hess wrote about this the other day, some possibilities. Do you have to figure out a way to only have half the kids at school on a given day? Do you have to figure out how to not have the buses be crowded? You want to have the kids stay in their classroom in high school rather than passing from class to class because you can't have crowded hallways. I mean, these are the sorts of things that, again, we're going to have to think through. And if that comes to pass, any of these possibilities, we've got to accept that there's going to continue to be a need for being able to do some learning at a distance, kids learning from home. So, it's not just the connectivity issue now or the printed materials now. That could be critical next school year as well. And I think as you think about philanthropy and the federal government's response, we should be thinking about what could folks use in terms of resources to make that kind of very strange school year be as strong as possible. As Celine and Andy both referenced, I had a Washington Post op-ed yesterday making the case that for a lot of schools, they may want to think about redshirting kids, about retaining most, if not all, of their students. In other words, especially elementary schools where the little kids are probably not able to do much at home via distance learning, especially low-income kids. So maybe Title I elementary schools, the default should be, let's have kids return to their teacher next fall, a teacher they already know, and have a year next year that's mostly about helping them catch up. These are kids who, by and large, were already below grade level. Doesn't make sense to push them ahead. And again, knowing how little we know about what next year is going to be like, that there could be so many more disruptions. Final thing is, just as we've got to think about not just K-12, but also the early childhood space, we got to think about not just the traditional public schools, but also charter schools and private schools. The private schools, Catholic schools, including those that serve a lot of poor kids and working class kids, are getting crushed. Of course, parents are in many cases not able to pay tuition and not going to pay tuition. You're going to see a lot of those families leave those private schools and enroll their kids in the traditional public schools, which have a big impact on the system. You think about the Catholic school sector that's been so shellacked in recent decades. What can we do to keep those schools alive? Charter schools, they still have the public funding, but a lot of them have relied heavily on private fundraising. They're not able to do their spring fundraisers, and they're getting hit as well. It will be interesting to see which of these private schools and charter schools apply for the Small Business Administration loans and grants. That is going to be a new, there's my dog. Sorry about that. Thunder saying hello. I think I'll leave it there. That's a good place to end.
Awesome. Well, that's a good bridge right to Paul, who has already begun to think about Stimulus 4.0, which we know is coming down the line. And so I think this circles back to what Andy started with, which was Stimulus 3.0 lacked any big ideas for what to do with education. There's money, there's not enough, and there's no kind of guiding ideology. So Paul, what do we think?
So hi, everybody. And it's great to see everybody. A lot of the folks who have spoken actually were really helpful in the last couple of weeks, helping me think through some of this. Andy helped me with a piece that I worked on for the Gadfly. So Mike, thank you for that. And Julie, thanks for your work in terms of helping Delaware on some of its work already. I run Rodell, which is an operating foundation in Delaware. So I live in Wilmington, and unlike Julie, I kind of live and work in the region in which we fund and support. And obviously, I think the national foundations usually have a bigger presence where they're located, but they have a broader scope. But the value of being in a place where we're actually on boards of local organizations and engaged on a daily basis, our kids are actually talking with the kids, or we're coaching kids that are actually in the schools. I have a sense of the day-to-day in a way that's probably a little different than some of the national foundations. The way we work is we think about aligning, catalyzing, and driving large-scale change, meaning that we serve as a group that kind of pulls the private-public sector together on a big issue, like, say, for example, career pathways. We then catalyze local and national dollars to get things off the ground. And then we drive large scale policy change to try and see those things be sustained and scaled. And the challenge for, or the reality for a foundation like us, which is I think the reality of GFP members, I'm not sure what percentage are smaller, more regional foundations, but there are some internal and external issues that are happening right now as it relates to this. On the internal side, obviously the stock market has taken a hit, so our corpus has taken a hit. And our partners that we co-invest with are often right now saying to me, well, we need to focus on the emergency needs. And so some of the bigger projects you've been working on, we're gonna have to shave that back a bit. And so for a lot of smaller regional foundations, they're actually thinking about layoffs and sort of shrinking. And so there's some internal issues that folks are wrestling with. We're in a position right now where we think we're going to be fine, but there's some significant issues there on the internal side. And externally, we're trying to figure out how best to add value. Mike, I was on a phone call with Chad in Ohio, and he and I are sort of analogous in the sense we work on some policy issues and some advocacy, but we're also doing some work in terms of co-investment. But one of the things he said and that we wrestle with is we don't want to engage on our traditional wonky issues around, whatever it might be, sort of thinking about curricular issues or policy issues in a way that sounds tone deaf to the immediacy of what we're facing right now. And so part of what we're trying to wrestle with externally is how do we add the most value and not be another of the thousands of emails about COVID-19 that's just sharing sort of redundant information. And so one of the things that I'd say there are probably 2 or 3 things that we're doing. One is we are sharing information that maybe we get access to on a national level that local folks are not as available, don't have available to them. We're finding targeted ways where there are gaps. Like, for example, I was talking to our state and local folks about Wi-Fi access and sort of connecting the dots, things that we wouldn't normally do, but just sort of trying to assess the issue. The other thing that I think we're able to do just on a local level, and I'll just end with the federal piece, but is that there's a lot of stuff happening and everybody is rushing to try and do something. Like I was on a call for an hour this morning about folks trying to fix the tech problem. And there was a person who's really well-intentioned, and this sounds a little bit pejorative, but who was basically saying, we're gonna get every kid broadband access, every kid a computer. And I was like, well, do you know that we just got $40 million, from federal stimulus dollars to help pay for some of that? You don't need to get the local funders to kind of engage on that, or that the county is already doing broadband access expansion. So I think part of what we can do is realize, to Julie's point, this is a bit of a marathon. While there's an urgency to act, we need to be thoughtful about it. And I think, I think particularly from the regional perspective, part of what we're going to try and do is say, yes, there may be some immediate things to do, but let's step back a little bit. We have to maintain a sense of urgency, but we also need to be thoughtful so that we're not just sort of flooding an already overwhelmed system with lots of well-intentioned ideas that don't really add up to a really coherent strategy. The last thing externally I would throw out is we are interested in trying to help inform the next stimulus package. And my understanding in talking to our US delegation and some other folks nationally is that on the House side, there's likely going to be a 4.0 from Speaker Pelosi, that would be about potentially inclusive of some big ideas on education. And in the piece that I shared via Gadfly, I put forward a few ideas and happy to go into those subsequently. But I think on the Senate side, McConnell is suggesting at this point he's looking to hold off and wanting to see how the last 2.2 trillion plays out. So I'm not sure if it's all going to flow right away, but I think from our perspective as funders, there's an opportunity to put some good ideas out there, not only for the next stimulus, but because we're also about to enter the transition planning period for the 2 presidential campaigns that'll likely emerge. And this summer is when they'll likely be putting together their big ideas for what they're going to do in the first 100 days. So even if it doesn't get incorporated into the next stimulus, there's an opportunity to still inform that national conversation. So let me pause there.
That's great. I do want to say to folks now, we're going to transition into a question period. So feel free to throw those questions into the chat box. Our panelists will be looking at the chat box. I will be looking at the chat box and trying to moderate it as best I can. I will say that sometimes when I do this, there are tons and tons of questions and it's hard, and sometimes there are very few. So I have my own questions prepared. All right. So Andy, I want to kind of circle back to you because you're doing a lot of work on the ground. So can you break it down for us? There are lots of different constituencies within education. How are these different constituencies faring? So you've got teachers, you've got higher income students, you've got lower income students, you've got you know, the central offices. What are you seeing in terms of these different kind of pieces of that education puzzle? And
Yeah, I guess
we
let's
can speak about pre-K, higher ed.
Sure.
Yeah.
We can start with the last one first. So that's central offices. I mean, anyone who's worked in or around school districts knows the decision-making protocol in most school districts boils down to sitting around the superintendent's conference room table and sort of hashing things out, and then sort of figuring out what you're going to do, and then maybe a few meetings after the meeting, right? None of that's possible now. And so central offices are really struggling with some basic stuff. How do you make good, effective decisions in a remote environment? Who has decision rights? Who should be handling which functions? Things like that. So it's stuff like that. And we're putting together some toolkits. To Julie's point, we want to put stuff together we can get out to the field rather than have to like sell it over and over again. That seems very inefficient at a time like this. And so there's just, people need some basic help on like, how do you do some basic functioning and systems like that? And they're getting hit both with the immediate stuff, and then they're starting to think about this longer term stuff as well. We still think most immediate. My own sense would be, I can't speak for my colleagues on the call, we have another couple of weeks to get right on making sure there's support in place for kids, or we've lost 6 months of learning for a lot of kids. And to Julie's point, I've experienced with a lot of folks a lack of urgency, as Julie was saying, that we have like months and months to sort of figure this out, or it's a slow moving thing. Like there are a lot of kids that don't have anything. And if we don't put something in place very quickly, it's 6 months lost. So to your question on how it's affecting students, I think overall, and Morgan Polikoff was tweeting about this yesterday on Twitter, and I was agreeing with him that I think overall the effects we're going to see down the road will actually probably be fairly, this will kind of wash out. But the reason for that is because that's an average. There's going to be extremely high variance within that average. High SES kids are relatively well positioned to weather this. Their parents are going to have access to various kinds of supports. Their schools are more likely to have something in place, even if it's just what we're calling remediation, or excuse me, what we're calling instruction. A lot of places is really remediation review, but they'll at least be getting that. The kids who are really going to bear the brunt of this are, as what usually happens, they're the kids who can least afford it. They're low-income kids, racial and ethnic minorities. They are more likely to not have access to those things, not have connectivity, not have that various kinds of social capital wrapped around them. They're the kids who need the system to do the most for them in normal times, and it struggles to do that, as everybody who works in this sector knows. And so it's really going to struggle in a time like this. And those are the kids we're particularly concerned about. Teachers, this is a challenge for teachers, obviously, and they're like everyone, they're dealing with this in their professional life and their response, and then they're also all dealing with it in their personal life as humans and as parents and caregivers and all the rest of it. And so they're under a lot of pressure. I'm not, to be at the risk of sounding crass, I'm not overly concerned about how they're going to fare, because they have the two most powerful interest groups in the country, quite literally, the two most powerful special interest groups in the country looking out for their interests. So I think they'll come through this okay in the end. When there's state policy being made and federal policy, there'll be people there looking out for their interests. I think what I'm hearing from them, and this is not something that we're going to solve through policy, the big thing we hear from teachers again and again is, because administrators don't know quite what to do here, teachers are getting stifled and they're frustrated. They want to do new things. They want to try new things, and they keep being told they can't do that. And that's extremely frustrating because the best way to learn what works is to see what's working and do sort of real fast feedback, whether that's just exit tickets for kids or looking at engagement data. There's a bunch of stuff we're trying to help school districts think about ways to real rapid cycle, figure out what's going on. There's opportunities to learn from that, but a lot of teachers feel like they're being stifled. They're being told not to move ahead, not to do new instruction and so forth. And I think that's the part of the teacher piece that I think we need to get on. And then finally, just within communities, look, the best of times. I mean, Paul told a story about sort of fragmentation a few minutes ago. We have that in the best of times. We don't have good coordination. Organizations don't work together well. There's not a seamless net there for kids. We know this, and that's like, again, that's the best of times when we can all get together face to face. Like, these are not the best of times. So as a rule, with all these groups, people are stepping up and there's some amazing stuff happening, but assume every bottleneck, friction point, and sort of breakdown that we traditionally deal with, assume it is exacerbated now just because of the just extraordinary circumstances that everyone's living through right now.
Well, and the Wall Street Journal today even kind of raised this question, and I've seen it prior to that on Twitter, around should we just stop trying to do any learning because doing any learning risks exacerbating inequity. Anyone want to jump in on that debate about the fact that it's more for some kids and there are those who would say maybe we stop all learning until we can be back in the classroom. Anyone?
I mean,
well, I
go ahead, Mike.
go ahead. No, you first. Julie.
I mean, for a while there, schools were not, there was regulation on the books that said you couldn't, unless you had equal access for all students, you could not educate others. Those who could have access, especially on the with virtual learning. And we were firmly against and tried to get that that language changed because of the need for kids to have what they can. I think we are part of a group of funders who are thinking about, when we think about now, a lot of people talk about this virtual learning time, and we have to reframe that. This is not virtual learning, to Paul and Andy's point, for everyone. This is continuing learning between now and the fall. And so how do we make that happen? There's a lot of the paper packages won't be enough, but I don't think we can just flip it off because we're not getting anyone. I think our challenge is, how do we reach more kids? And what are the simple things like reading? Let's not try to do to solve everything and make this the absolute best. But if all kids were reading 2 hours a day, that would actually improve a lot of what they're able to access. So we might be getting too complicated in the solutions.
Totally.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And there's a lot schools can be doing. They could be calling kids every day or every other day to find out how things are going. That's a pretty low tech possibility, and seems doable. But the only exception I would make is, and I forget who floated this idea, but it's interesting to say, well, if a district said, we're going to actually end the school year right now, so that we bank all those days, and we're going to restart the school year on July 1st. And the teachers union is on board with that, and that's what we're going to do with the calendar. I could see that argument. The problem is, who knows if we're going to be ready by July 1st to open back up again. So, I just think given that you got to serve as many kids as fast as possible as you possibly can, knowing it will be imperfect. But also, as Andy had said, let's have high expectations.
I think it might be your earbud, but there's a little bit of a scratchy noise.
Oh, sorry.
The one thing I just add to that is we talk about, we keep talking about reopening as if there's some period where schools are going to reopen, whether it's July, as Mike just said, or for the fall 2021 school year. And that at that point, things will get back to normal. Realistically, if you believe sort of the best information we're getting from public health experts, it'll probably be a little less than a year from now until we have a true vaccine online. Obviously, that vaccine will be triaged, so first responders, at-risk populations, and so forth will get it first. So it'll take some time. And so we are probably looking at a disrupted school year next year too. And again, so that's when people are looking at this weeks and months. And so we're going to need to think about next year. It probably will not be the kind of closures that we're seeing right now, parts of the country, life will start to return to some approximation of normal, but there'll be cluster closures. There'll be schools that have to close because somebody there has been exposed. We can assume that there'll be more and more testing online, so we'll be able to pursue a more aggressive public health strategy that way. And so schools are going to need a lot of help. How do you, without like losing a lot of learning and having a lot of disruption and not just sending kids home, how do you close for 3 weeks when you've got to close for a cluster containment because there's been an outbreak in your community or somebody in your school community has been exposed? We're working on a toolkit. We're looking for support to build a toolkit to help do that. But that's the kind of thing that in terms of we think about sort of disrupted learning and so forth, that we're going to have to be thinking about. And I worry we've gotten ourselves in this mindset of when this is going to be over rather than like how do we prepare for a while of sort of different variances of this and make sure it's as least disruptive to kids as possible, knowing again that the kids who need the most from their public schools traditionally get the least and are particularly going to get the least in very acute ways with all these disruptions we're experiencing.
That's helpful. I'm going to go to the chat box, and this one is to Julie, but others can answer as well. Reference to what you said before about communication and collaboration, a smart collective strategy around education giving, given that given that there are some things that some people can fund and some can't. So what are some of the mechanisms that you're seeing around that? What sorts of communication and collaboration are starting to happen?
Yeah, I think this is where we're seeing a lot of, hi Alice. This is where we're seeing a lot of collaborations, like pickup. So if there was, we work in criminal justice as well. So those funder groups and then our work in education and across education, we've been able to pull together about 17 foundations just randomly that are mostly national, some are regional, happy to add more people in. And, just did kind of a whip around. This is maybe 2 weeks ago now, which feels like, eons ago. And folks were just saying this is what they're working on. And it actually fell neatly into some, just a few buckets. I'll read them out. But Alice, to your point, like the idea is that groups would come together, figure out what are the key questions, figure out how to put funding out to help to get solutions to those, and then get it out to the field. And so there's an information sharing piece, like when I talked earlier about the SBA loans going to support nonprofits. At least our grantees were completely unaware of that program. And so this was a conduit for us to be able to collect information, send it out to our grantees, send it out to the funders that were on this group, and then they could send it out to their grantees as well. So there's a bit of people who are interested in the same questions coming together, but then there's also, even if you're not interested in something and have prioritized it, getting information from others. So let me just go through the groups really fast. I don't want to take the time to go deep, we can follow up. So one is like thinking about this continuing learning. What does learning look like now through, and I agree with Andy, reopening, but there will be a time when folks say officially the next school year has started, and that's kind of the split. So it started as virtual learning and pretty quickly became virtual plus non-virtual. So the continuation of learning now. Restarting school, the instructional continuity, and looking at this through the lens of what's the mental health and social and emotional supports that students and adults need? How do we provide the best learning and academics for supports for students and for all students? To Andy's point, how do we plan for the future about rolling closures, absenteeism, virtual environments going forward, and then all the operational stuff that districts need, like resource allocation, HR, all these things, toward coming up with like playbooks or guides or options so that systems and schools can have, and states can kind of have these at the ready. So that's the instructional continuity and starting in when school restarts. College access, persistence, and retention. We've talked about the early kids, the kids who have, gone through, especially, our focus on low-income kids of color who are in college now, face a lot of barriers to re-enrolling. This is the moment where they're so close to being on a path toward upward social mobility and they're about to get knocked off. So how do we support them? Stimulus and policy, what kind of ideas can come up through that? And then parent supports and communications. What kind of information can we get to parents? Who's the best amplifier? How do we make that simplified? And then getting some data back to understand what the voices are of parents. And then a new group just got added on research and evaluation. So that's kind of one of the very specific things we're doing, but really trying to get folks to be in communication and collaboration through funder collaboratives.
That's really helpful. And I see some things going on in the chat box around other places doing, and what they're doing. So this is great. Anyone else want to jump in here? Paul, you referenced this a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's sort of national collaboratives and there's regional. Most regions have a or regional area grant makers, like a RAG they call them. And those are often kind of working together with local funders. We're part of our community foundation, so at the state level. So there's definitely a lot of collaboration. I would say though, big picture, when I think about the role of philanthropy versus public dollars, oftentimes we're good at being a bit more risk tolerant and taking the first step on things. And so there may be some early stage things that funders can step in on to address, to Andy's points, or some of these immediate needs. But I think from the state policy perspective, I work closely with our governor's office. They're trying to get a sense of how is the federal stimulus going to play out? How are we going to then complement that, knowing that there's going to be budget shortfalls by June? So they're thinking about how the dominoes are going to fall in terms of federal dollars, and then state dollars are going to follow from that. And then there are going to be likely a next phase of philanthropic gaps that I think we could begin to fill. So, I mean, I think it's early stage, we can maybe act more quickly, but next stage, I think, is going to be that there's going to be some significant gaps, particularly around access and thinking about equity issues that are likely not going to get filled with the federal or state dollars.
Great. Well, I want to go to kind of big picture for a minute, and I know all of you on the panel are big picture thinkers. I got to know many of you right around the time of the '08 stimulus, when there were lots of funders, lots of folks in education reform who came together and said, if there's going to be a flood of money to public education, let's make sure that it has some purposes, some big ideas behind it. And so the Race to the Top was born and really guided a lot of our work perfectly and imperfectly over the next decade. So, there are a few things that you might hypothesize could emerge from this period of time in terms of big ideas. So maybe it's something around technology and distance learning. Maybe it's something around finally acknowledging how much schools do in terms of basic needs. Maybe it's something else. Do we see any opportunities for bigger ideas to emerge and get pushed forward as we reconsider everything that we're doing in education and have different new floods of money coming in?
Let me jump in there real quick, just because we were one of the first recipients around the Race to the Top dollars, and use that as a launching point for the next phase. I mean, I think one of the things, we were big supporters of the Race to the Top concept, and just the idea of really catalyzing big ideas through this competition. And on the positive side, I think there was more done in that short period of time than we probably would have gotten in decades done in terms of building infrastructure around standards, accountability, et cetera. But one of the things that we found is Delaware got $119 million in that first tranche. And it took a long time to even spend that much money. And we had a year plus of planning prior to that. And so one of the cautions around this is that getting federal dollars is seemingly a great idea, but spending it well, given particularly the exacerbated decision-making processes in each of the districts, is going to be really complicated. But in terms of some big ideas, I think I put forward three. There's probably a dozen others, but one is really preparing for the next, for being truly prepared for remote learning. Thinking about the broadband access and actually good actual content and delivery. The second is that there's been 35 or so governors have engaged on career pathways connecting college and high school. And we've been thinking about, could that same sort of set of on-ramps be helpful for not only the next generation, but adults that get displaced? And then the third is that to get everybody back to work, we're going to need a good early childhood infrastructure and K-12 system. And so a much deeper investment in early childhood, such that folks can have confidence to go back to school or work. So those are three big ideas that I think maybe we could begin to stimulate, and maybe they begin to start addressing the inequities that are baked into the current system.
So I guess three I don't know. So 3 quick ones. I don't know if this is going to be the big moment for online. Everybody thinks it's going to be. I think there's some great online stuff out there. There's also some stuff that's not so great. So I think parents are having mixed experiences and so forth. And the idea that this is going to be, people are going to get a taste of this and everyone's going to want their kid in online school, I don't think that's actually going to be borne out. I do think, though, it could be the really big moment for competency-based education, because people are realizing that you can sort of have tasks defined by sort of mastery and competence of the task. That's how a lot of kids are experiencing what they're getting now. And I think it's going to point out to parents the attraction of that. And also, frankly, just how much time, and we all know this, and teachers complain about this all the time, just how much time gets wasted in schools with non-instructional stuff, the amount of time during the school day that's actually instructional time. There's other things that schools do that's important, but there's like, everybody knows it's a lot of slippage. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing, I do think on the connectivity, like, I worry it's going to be way too late to address the equity challenges that are out there right now. And so that's why we have to act much more urgently. But at the end of the day, because of the federal money that's being pushed out, more people will have access to broadband than was the case before this. That's a good thing. It shouldn't take a pandemic for that to happen, but that's a good thing. Just given just how ubiquitous the internet is in our lives and so forth. And so I think that's not a small thing. The third one I'm hoping, and I don't know if this will be the case or not, is our healthcare system is just a complete patchwork. People know this. And that gets to, like, when you get out into rural communities, even like, emerge EMS, how badly supported it often is and so forth. And people don't stop to think about this, because thankfully for most people, they interact with this only episodically. I'm hoping that what comes out of this, and this ties into what Paul was talking about with sort of on-ramps and so forth, the population's getting older. Healthcare is a field that's going to continue to grow, and there's going to continue to be needs there. And there's aspects of that that simply cannot be outsourced given the nature of it. And that this leads to, like, a lot of emphasis on not only skilled nursing and so forth, but also sort of EMT level, paramedic level stuff, different kinds of careers and on-ramps into the healthcare field. I think states need to be stepping up on that a lot more. And some of that's a resource problem, some of that's a training problem. And I'm hoping that this is a sort of a national wake-up call that, like, we have got to do better than this sort of crazy quilt that exists across our country right now.
That's great. We have a question that ties into something Mike had been talking about a little bit earlier. So in all seriousness, have we heard anything from states and districts about redshirting kids, canceling summer vacation, otherwise taking action? An idea of, in Tennessee, a summer surge over the next few years. Anything that we're hearing that is concrete on that topic?
Not yet. I haven't heard anything concrete yet. I think there are people out there intrigued by some of these ideas. Again, how do you start to plan, given that we can't plan? So I think that's the challenge.
Totally fair.
If I can just add a little bit to the question about the stimulus or another race to the top, I like a lot of the ideas Andy and Paul threw out there. I am very doubtful that we're going to have interest in having the federal government push any of those ideas from the top down right now. I just still don't think there's an appetite for that. I think if there were an appetite, or if we started getting into that conversation, I think that the Trump administration would push hard on some school choice ideas, which, some of which I would think could be useful right now. How do you maybe give Title I kids access to online tutoring or other kinds of supports that they could get to without going through districts, that kind of thing. But, the wheels will come off any kind of bipartisanship at that point. And look, the clock is ticking. I think I'm waiting for the Tea Party types in the Republican Party to remember again that they were concerned about budget deficits. I mean, I would certainly make the case that this is not the time to be worried about budget deficits and our huge national debt. But, you can imagine that happening at some point, that there could be part of the Republican caucus could get tired of these huge federal stimulus bills. And I am quite certain they'll be tired of it after the November election if Joe Biden wins. That you can imagine all of a sudden Donald Trump is not going to be very interested in pushing for that. So anyway, I think we learned from the recession, the Great Recession, that you do want to do what you can at the federal level to prop up state and local revenue because they can't do it on their own because they have to balance their budgets. And so if you don't, you're going to see huge cuts in spending, and that does hurt kids. It hurts achievement. It hurts on lots of other things. So, you know, it may be that, you know, keeping the bills clean and just doing the funding at this point, even as a card-carrying education reformer, I may say that that's what we got to focus on right now.
Yeah, just piggyback on that. Thanks. I haven't heard anything specific about to your question, Dale, but I think people are just trying to figure it out. And then in terms of the stimulus, I agree with Mike's point about there's unlikely to have, you know, something dramatic and focus on education. So we were thinking about it, you know, in this last stimulus, there was some tax relief given to folks who donate philanthropically. And that was those specifically for 2020. Can we get that to be something that gets put in place and locked down for permanently? Is there some way that we can get something around volunteerism to encourage volunteerism? Because maybe one way that we can really help to catch up kids is to get more folks involved in volunteers and well-structured volunteer programs. And that seems that that's kind of a conversation I understand is kind of bouncing around. And then some of the stuff, like when I talked earlier about the food access and getting those dollars onto SNAP cards, I think some of these things we could be laying the track so that they solve future problems, right? Because schools, as you all know, especially regional funders know, they distribute food over the summer in the same way they are now, and there's a very low uptake of those meals and those dollars. So could we create some solutions now that then carry through and help to solve basic needs for kids later? And I feel like this is, you know, these things, even though they might not be right at the heart of education, are super important, because if there's one thing we've learned, and I think that people are facing, is like students don't show up, kids show up. And that's why this balance between basic needs and funding educational work is challenging. We have to figure out, I think, you know, just thinking about this as a whole kid and what's in the stimulus packages for the whole child that shows up is just as important as anything specific to education, especially given the opportunities or lack thereof.
I think that's right. I think that gets to the topic of systems disruption. And, you know, in an ideal world, we move to a place where there were some systems that don't work or are too siloed end up getting dramatically changed. So with that, I'd love for you to all have a closing word. This is a very heavy topic. It's very uncertain. It's very hard. We know it's very inequitable. So I'd love to just end with a whip around that is either, you know, something you've learned that you think is an important takeaway from this time, something that is a glimmer of hope, something that we can continue to dig deeper on and learn about, something to end with the oxygen to get through the rest of the day.
I'll go first because there's always that pause, right? So I'll jump in. I think if anything, we understand that in uncertain times, there's no easy answers, and that we're going to experience this in waves. And sometimes we're going to feel like we got this, we've got the vision, we understand the path, and then we're going to feel overwhelmed by the enormity and just question ourselves. But just, especially in given our positions, the need to just keep going, listen to voices is so critical. And I mean, I end every day, I'm thinking like each of us is in a leadership position. So who do we want to be and how do we define our leadership in this moment? And so I end every day watching the press conferences of Rhode Island's Governor, Gina Raimondo, because I just think she is just top notch in figuring out how to do this. And I just encourage all of us to think about, like, as we are carrying so many others, how do we do that well, but while also taking care of ourselves? And so, you know, find a leader that you want to learn from in these times. And I think for me, that sometimes helps me get through some hard things during the day.
Awesome.
I think, look, we've learned, it's been remarkable the amount of change that we've seen in society as a whole and in our schools, right? It's incredible. Most people are taking these warnings seriously. They're doing what they've been asked to do, and they're staying home, even at risk to their own economic livelihood. It's pretty inspiring. There are a few yahoos out there, but there's not that many of them. And so I think that's good. And look, I do see the schools of all stripes, public, charter, private, Catholic, you name it, just trying to do amazing things right now. You know, that I do think it's not just a bubble. I think there's a lot of places that are really experimenting and doing things they never thought they would be able to do. I enjoy listening to the Zoom call with my 10-year-old's third grade class every day. It's super cute, but it's also, you know, pretty impressive. They're getting back to teaching. And so there's some good things happening. I think a lot of us may look back on parts of this experience quite fondly. seeing people rise to the occasion.
So I guess I would say this is obviously horrible and there's a lot of suffering going on, but is there anything better than a highly contagious pathogen to remind us how interconnected we all are, and that basic sort of John Donne idea that no person is an island? And this may, like, for all the horror show that it's putting on, this may also be the thing that reminds us about our connectivity and our dependence on one another. And that may be a good thing.
I would just build on that. One of the things as leaders that I would just echo the comment that Julie made about just taking care of yourself, but also connect a bit more than normal. Like, so I have a small team, about 12 people, but I'm making a point of making individual check-ins every week with folks, which I normally wouldn't do. And just by virtue of seeing their kids and their dogs and things like that, in some ways we're actually connecting in a way that I think is a bit richer than I might do if I saw them in the kitchen in the office. So I think just on a personal level, taking care of yourself, because you can take care of others better if you are healthy yourself, but then try and connect a bit more than normal. And then the last thing I would just say is that perhaps there are some opportunities in this crisis, to Julie's point about laying the tracks. What can we lay the tracks for, or maybe it was Mike's comment, lay the tracks for that will help us move in the future? For example, we talked about technology infrastructure. Perhaps that not only helps with education, but that helps with healthcare if we go to telehealth. Maybe there's some interesting sort of unusual solutions that we come up with in this crisis that actually create a better path for us. So I try and focus on those things to keep me focused on the positive.
Thank you all. This was a really useful conversation, hopefully the first of many. We have contact information for all of these guys if you want to do more learning with them, and we have recorded this session. So thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of the day.